Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Vincent Waratmaja, and I'm the Government Affairs Manager with the Climate Center. The Climate Center is an NGO working to turn bold ideas into action for a climate-safe future. And today, we're proud to introduce climate scientist Dr. Dan Kammen to present on going carbon negative and equity positive by 2035 in California. Dan is the Distinguished Professor of Energy at the University of California, Berkeley, with parallel appointments in the Energy and Resources Group, the Goldman School of Public Policy, and the Department of Nuclear Engineering. Kammen is also the founding director of the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Lab, co-director of the Berkeley Institute of the Environment, and director of the Transportation Sustainability Research Center. And finally, Kammen is also serving as the Senior Advisor for Energy, Climate, and Innovation for USAID and is part of the Power Africa team. So without further ado, Professor Kammen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks all of you for being here who are not at the President Biden event. I appreciate the empty stage, but what I want to focus on today is the opportunity for those economies that have a deep bench, a resource base like California, to innovate for themselves and to innovate in partnership with others. And a key feature of that story that I hope will be clear in these comments is that the old paradigm that environmental protection was one category and social justice was another is now a clearly demonstrated false approach to the problem. In fact, the new adage, the new tweetable moment is that we can't solve climate without environmental, racial, and gender justice, and we can't truly address environmental, racial, and gender injustice without addressing climate change. And I think that story, while it sounds good at a high level, has detailed, concrete manifestations that every economy can take. Now, I'll use the Kenyan economy as the example, but I hope you'll all see that there are multiple opportunities to translate, to adapt, and to use these messages in a variety of contexts. Anything that I'll be saying today can be found not only on the Climate Center's website, where you'll see op-eds that we've written, the testimonies and bills that we've written, but also on the webpage of my laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley. It's called RAIL, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. And you can also find these comments on the Twitter feed of the laboratory, which is listed under my name, Dan_Kammen. The starting point of this discussion is that until the recent climate announcements by a number of heads of state, in particular the United States with the election of President Biden, was that the global path was very clearly centered on the blue lines, roughly 3 degrees Celsius of climate warming by 2100. That is essentially a death knell for ecosystems as we know it. It's a near complete destruction of the coral reef system. It's a destruction of most of the nearshore fisheries, the so-called recruitment of young fish. It is a recipe for fires like we've seen in California, Greece, Siberia, and Australia to be the new 5th season of the year, the anthropogenic parallel to winter, summer, spring, and fall, now winter, summer, spring, and fall, and the fire calamity. And that recipe is one where each 1/10 of a degree of reduction has a dramatic benefit to rich and poor communities alike. And as a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I can say definitively that the science of this story has now been in for well over 5 years. I would argue longer, but it's clear at this point. And so getting out of this blue zone, pun intended for those of us at COP, and getting into this mauve zone, the optimistic scenarios of cutting our emissions down to 2 degrees is a minimum step. We are not on pace for even that today. And what the IPCC has recommended, and which multiple reports coming out at this COP have highlighted, is that the true zone, the green zone, where none of us are today, is where we need to be on this graph. That green zone is a 1.5 degree scenario The door to that scenario is almost closed. It is not fully closed today. But even if we miss it, that doesn't mean we don't need to be maximally aggressive. We critically have to get down into as close to 1.5 degrees net warming as possible and arguably go carbon negative. One of the critical reasons to set up why the just transition, or focusing on the least empowered, the most marginalized ethnic minority groups, lowest income populations, women and others, is highlighted in this compilation. And that is the richest 1% of humanity, whether they live in the United States or the Gambia or New Zealand or Bangladesh, contribute roughly 11% of total global greenhouse emissions. And the richest 10% contribute they contribute over half, 52% of global emissions. That is an unacceptable ratio, and it's one that everyone in this conference needs to take seriously. We talk about it, we don't do much about it. The poorest 40%, the middle 40% is often called, contribute about 40%, and the poorest 50% of the planet contribute to 7% of emissions. The inequality, the environmental injustice equation here is clear, and what it means analytically is that we are going to need to see an unheard of factor of 30 reduction in emissions by the richest 1% of the planet, so that the poorest 50% have a little space to grow, have a doubling or tripling of their current emissions. There is no indication at this point that we are on path for that. But again, I'll highlight from what's taken place in California as a start to that dialogue. It is really where the investments need to go over the coming decades. And it's why the President of the United States is in town here in Sharm el-Sheikh, the only leader in the top 4 emitters to have the courage to show up. The others chose to stay away for a variety of reasons. But it highlights the degree to which talk is cheap, PowerPoints are cheap, power plants are expensive. The California story illustrates this transition in a couple different ways, and I'll highlight one of them. California didn't pass its first whole of economy clean energy plan until 2006, which called for California to get to zero emissions in 2045. But it initially called for a step for us to get to 20% powered by green energy by 2010. We missed that target through a party. However, we did make that target 3 years later in 2013. Our next target was to be 1/3 powered by renewable energy by 2020. California, while missing the 2010 target, made the 2020 target 3.5 years early. California, I want to note, does not count nuclear, and it does not count large hydro as its clean energy mix. And that is not the same in every jurisdiction around the world, but it highlights how quickly you can go. From there, California had a target to be 50% powered by renewables by 2030. That target was accelerated to be 60% because of how quickly we'd made the next targets. And California is now at a point where we routinely operate well over 60% green energy targets. And I'll highlight that story next. California's current law on the books is to be carbon neutral by 2045. However, by reaching these targets today, California has accelerated that mandate so that our target for renewables is now one that is being accelerated forward. There's legislation going on right now because of the innovation equation around renewable energy. That's illustrated in kind of 3 iconic graphs. They all show the price of renewable energy over time. Wind power has declined in price by 60% over the past decade, and both solar and energy storage have declined by 90% over the past decade. And I anticipate that offshore wind will follow the same pattern. I also think that hydrogen production, in terms of cost, will also decline by more than 90% in the coming decade. That's not a guesstimate. That is based on the historical trends of these other technologies. What that means today is that renewable energy for most of the world is now cheaper to build a new clean energy power plant than to simply operate an existing fossil fuel plant. I want to say that once again because it's shocking to many, and there are experts in the field who still sadly don't seem to believe it. This low-cost world we're in for renewables means we can think dramatically differently. It means we can invest in energy justice on racial, gender, and socioeconomic grounds. It means we can think very much differently about traditional tasks like waste remediation, like buildings, so that we can think now about solar buildings in cities that generate the majority of their energy by not only covering walls with solar, but utilizing transparent solar cells on windows, to think very differently about the energy generation from clean sources across our economy. In terms of California's progress and the lessons learned along the way, not all of them have come easy, but California in 2021 hit 95% clean energy. Briefly during the springtime, our optimal season of best wind, best solar, relatively low demand. What this means is that California has gone from a net importer of energy for much of the year to a net exporter of renewable energy green electrons during that ideal season in the spring. The question is, if we can do it for a few minutes, a few hours, a few days in the spring, what can we do more broadly? Well, that story is one that's been highlighted by what's taken place in California now this coming year, where what we've seen is that we have hit over 100% clean energy again for those same ideal springtime months. This May, we hit 104% of electricity from renewables. And remember, California is on par. We might be a little larger or a little bit smaller than Germany. California with roughly 40 million residents, Germany with 83 million residents, is an economy here that is humming along, and is humming along in a renewable energy dominated landscape, even without nuclear and large hydro. Large hydro will certainly not be part of our mix, but nuclear may be, depending on how we innovate, how we deal with safety and waste issues. And so we'll see. There might be other new clean energy mixes coming in. Nuclear could be there. We could also be getting there with offshore wind, but this highlights that this is far from the end of an innovation pathway. And I say that because as we cross the point where we are a 100% renewable energy economy, it's beholden on us to both invest the benefits of that in underserved communities and to work aggressively with partners, as I'll describe in a second, to make this equation go so that we become a clean energy and a green jobs exporter and a learning opportunity for others. This is why in a recent op-ed in the Los Angeles Times, I called on our governor and the legislature to aggressively accelerate the clean energy zero carbon landscape from a 2045 goal to a 2030 or 2035 goal. And this is something where the Climate Center in California has been an instrumental partner in both looking at how do we translate this into legislative action, how do we take advantage of this in terms of partnerships, not only with other states, but with other jurisdictions like Mexico, China, Canada, and others. I'll just conclude with a few comments around how easy this is if we invest aggressively, and how possible it will be to transform the economy despite many of the naysayers around the expense of renewables. I've already highlighted the cost, but the second part of the story is documented in this chart that shows the number of jobs, both those direct jobs in industry and those that are in industries that support the power sector or the vehicle sector, and those that are induced in industries that then supply those. And what you see is that the number of jobs per dollar invested, per megawatt installed, is 2 to 3 to even 4 times higher in clean energy. What that means is that as industry shifts to clean energy, policy plays a critical role. We don't want to abandon current fossil fuel producing areas in California, Kern County, in West Virginia and Wyoming, where we produce coal, or the 1 million people involved in the coal sector in China. These are job opportunities that we need public policy to place the new clean energy industries there to address environmental issues, racial justice, and the employment transition that we can get from clean energy, but not all leaders are recognizing the opportunity to build on. I'm going to close this out in a nod to our president, who is landing here in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27 now, to talk about not only the Inflation Reduction Act, but the degree to which integrating in clean energy, job-producing policy at the national level is part of an agenda that we've now seen has held back any conservative so-called red wave. At most, it might be a few pink spots on the map, but that's a lesson that needs to be exported. And that is, you can make bold climate decisions as part of a socially progressive agenda. And I can name many states and jurisdictions and countries that have not recognized the full benefits of that picture. I'll just conclude with the many areas we have not even brought into scale here. We have not invested significantly in offshore wind or offshore tidal or wave energy. There's opportunities to build out the ocean energy system as well as sustainable ocean-based food. The more complementary we bring on offshore wind, and you can see here with the black line that the peaks during the year of offshore wind in North America complement our onshore resources. And we can also think creatively about mixed methods. We can think about offshore wind energy above surface, but also buoys to do current and tidal energy below surface. We can tie that into electricity sales when price is high, hydrogen production when price is low. That gives us a landscape that brings together a range of these technology options. And this is really one way to take the infamous duck curve that paralyzed utilities 10 years ago. And what they were worried about was, as we installed more renewables, the net demand would drop. And as the net demand dropped, the marginal cost, marginal value of renewables would decrease. And what we've seen instead is that if you complement your clean energy demand during the day with powering up electric vehicles, trains, buses, airplanes, what have you, you can take advantage of that. You can build a larger market for that clean energy and find ways where the synergies of clean beget more clean. And that's a recipe for jobs. That's a recipe to accelerate the transition. And it's an argument against all of the naysayers who claim that the clean energy transition is one that will be expensive or disruptive. This is a job creator, equity producing economic change where we need to get on with the job. So I just want to highlight that we know many of the places where our current choices lead to vast injustices. This is just an op-ed in the New York Times and one in the San Francisco Chronicle highlighting that for many people in many countries, as jobs concentrate in urban areas, what we see is that the poorer you are, the further you have to drive or commute to get to those jobs. What they say is you need to drive until you qualify to afford housing. That is a mistake of the utmost order. Decentralized clean energy, clean mass transit are complements. They produce jobs, they reduce congestion, they improve qualities of life. These are all aspects of that transition that we have barely begun to scratch. Last piece is that as we exit the fossil fuel economy, we are entering the metals and materials economy. And that means environmental and racial justice around mining. This is a very traditional mine for cobalt in the Congo. And the demand for rare earths, for lithium, for many of the metals are expected to grow by up to 1,000% by 2050. If we don't take the same lens of environmental justice and the jobs, benefits of clean energy and making recycling job one, we are going to go from one bad situation, the fossil fuel economy, to an equally bad situation with clean energy but with massive inequalities and environmental damage. This is not a hard equation. We've barely begun to innovate in terms of recycling lithium, getting rid of cobalt from the equation, harvesting lithium directly from seawater at costs less than mining anywhere. These are all parts of that transition, all of which we can do if we recognize that the green energy economy is a job creator. So you don't even have to be a bold politician to take these together. You just need to be one that reads and believes in the science to recognize that there are more opportunities in green than what we're leaving behind. I want to thank you for attending, and I look forward to the questions and to seeing where we get in terms of this dialogue. So let's go green. Let's take advantage of the numbers and go from there.
Thank you, Dan, so much. That was a fascinating presentation. Given we have a short time left, I want to turn it over to audience questions before I pose a couple questions to Professor Kammen. Does anyone have any questions?
And I'll repeat. Oh, the mic. Okay, great.
It's not a question. I just want to thank you for all the information. I'm really happy to hear it, and I would love to find out more about it. We have a lot of problems with mining, proposed mining in Ireland for the renewable transition, and I hadn't heard that you can get lithium from seawater, so that's one takeaway.
Yeah, I do indeed, and because the question, the questioner or the thank you, the comment from Ireland, I just want to highlight that what Ireland has done is a fascinating example of taking the resources available and transitioning it. So in the United States, we have focused largely on solar and wind in the Midwest as our prime renewable energy resources. And a decade ago, there was a real question. What are northern latitude areas going to do to deal with the clean energy transition? Ireland and Denmark are global leaders in developing the offshore wind, the offshore tidal industries, so that it actually looks in some equations easier to go green via diversified wind background than even thinking about solar and wind together. So what Ireland has done to start is critical, but the question about mining is absolutely one that we're all going to have to take seriously. Large and small scale mining has huge environmental damages, water damages, air quality. This is not a safe or fun form of living in terms of being a miner, but many of the materials we need are actually available if we were to rapidly and aggressively ramp up our recycling. We waste massive amounts of both heavy so-called rare earths and light materials. And what we really need to see is the richer economies, I include Ireland and the US in that, making recycling and making the process of finding alternatives for the most damaging materials like cobalt, replacing them with others that are less damaging, and to make the metals and materials transition co-equal with the greening of the economy. So thank you for asking, and we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. It's a terrific presentation, and I really appreciate your focus on justice in transition. Could you speak a little more to something that you said, which is the cost of renewables is cheaper than the cost of fossil fuels? I saw by one chart that actually there are more jobs generated through renewables. What accounts for the difference? Is it a difference in capital input? Does it assume the same labor level? I know that for a lot of workers, working in refineries is family sustaining. Working solar rooftop is not. So I appreciate
it's
that.
a great question. I think it really has to do, well, I think the way I'll answer it is it really has to do with how we think about jobs. So the reason why renewable energy is cheaper today and produces more jobs is because renewable energy systems don't have fuel costs. That's kind of the definition of renewable. So you're buying capital, hardware, and you're buying knowledge and labor to build the technologies. You're effectively not pouring some of the money down an oil well. In fact, when you buy a natural gas power plant, I'm going to call it fossil gas to be clear and a little provocative, but when you buy a fossil gas power plant, 30% of the cost is up front. 70% is the cost of the fuel over a 2-decade lifetime. When you buy renewable energy power plant, solar or wind or a battery, 100% of, or close to 100% of the cost is up front because there is no fuel cost. It's just the operations and labor down the line. So that's why there are more jobs available, because you're investing in knowledge in companies and large and small businesses. And it's also why this perception that there are not as many jobs and they might be transitory. Somehow, if you're an oil or gas worker, and I was just down in a coal mine in Chile talking to some of the miners, and they were worried. They said, if you close the coal mine, what do we do? And I said, well, government policy in Chile is aggressive in terms of implementing clean energy manufacturing hubs. And where are we most likely to build those hubs? It's where there's clean energy to power them. The Atacama Desert is where Chile mines, but it's also their best site for renewable energy, both solar and wind. So what Chile is doing is taking a whole economy approach. They're building manufacturing facilities for renewable energy at the mine mouths, and they're doing so powered by renewables. So that's an equation that might happen naturally, but if governments don't step in and push, might not. And the last thing you want to do is to abandon former fossil fuel areas. It's why China's goal for carbon neutrality in 2060, which is too slow, is one that they announced because they're worried that they won't be able to move enough companies into the current coal zones, Shaanxi province, Shandong, and some of the western areas in China. But that's where this interaction between entrepreneurs and clean energy and public policy is so critical. And we won't get to this transition if we don't marry those together. And again, I'll just close by that's why the work of groups like the Climate Center is so critical, because they see how to engage with the private sector and how to push and enable legislators to build this where we need to. So great question. Thank you.
I think we got time for like a very quick question.
So Eric Tambo from the United Nations University. So you mentioned also that the green hydrogen is also coming up and the cost will also decrease. So when we look in many European countries, the strategies is to go in Africa and then to produce in battery and re-export that. So we are fearing more or less a new scheme of colonialism because it's a raw material. So coming and exploiting in the next. What is the US perspective on collaborating with African countries when it comes to green hydrogen? Because they are also use cases. It could be used also to improve the livelihood, economic sectors in many of these countries. But so far, many of the Western countries are more looking at more from the so just to think on the just transition. So what is the perspective of the US government in these sectors? And maybe another short one also, many of these African countries have fossil fuel. So, and what will happen?
We won't have time for the second one. I can just see here in the back.
So thank you.
So very quickly on this question, you're absolutely right. If Western governments aren't pushed at meetings like this and pushed hard, they will invest for their own benefit. Right now, the largest tracts of new oil and gas exploration are in the Congo Basin, and they're Western companies looking to exploit, saying no gas in Africa or no gas for Africa, but we'll harvest it, thank you very much. That's not a just transition. A just transition is one where we do projects like what Namibia and Botswana negotiated with the US government called Mega Solar. That's to install transmission and solar in Botswana and Namibia, and to request the funds and to request private sector developers so that not gray and not blue, but green hydrogen will be produced by these gigawatt scale facilities in Namibia. That's an example of investing to enable African governments to lead the transition, not to be left behind once again.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you so much, audience members. We really appreciate it.